Thank you. Um, so I want to build on what Anita just said about the measures of well-being and these metrics for well-being. And there's been a lot of very interesting things said over the last 2 days, but one line really stuck with me, and I haven't stopped thinking about it ever since Sister Helen Alford pronounced it yesterday morning. And it was the fact that we need economic wealth as a foundation for life. And I was thinking about how that relates to happiness and well-being. And I was trying to triangulate that with an article that I wrote in response to the 2015 World Happiness Report that was conducted by a team around Jeff Sachs and the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network. And for those, we were talking about it last night or yesterday over lunch, but for those who aren't familiar with it, it's a ranking of countries around the world that kind of measure sentiments of happiness or sadness. And it's based on a Gallup World Poll, and it's basically looking at experience such as positive experience such as smiling or laughter, and negative experience like stress and depression. And I wrote that article in 2015 because in that global ranking, the _1 happiest country in the world was Switzerland. It's very close to here. And dead last was my own country, Togo, which was considered, according to those metrics and those sentiments, the unhappiest country in the world. And I started thinking about my own life and my own experience with poverty and what that meant with respect to happiness and what that meant with respect to human potential. And it starts with the way that I was raised in Togo, and it's a very unusual childhood. Unusual because my mom and dad met in the 1970s and fell in love and had 2 kids within a 15-month period. And what was really unusual about the way they broke up is that when they broke up, when my sister was only 1 year old and I was 2 years old, my dad, who came from a very powerful political family, who had 2 uncles who had been president of Togo, and who himself had very, very, I'll just call it vocal ambitions. He had just been named Minister of Finance in Togo. And when he broke up, my mom, who actually never went to primary school, she did 1 year in primary school, because this was a time when my grandfather on my mom's side had just left. My grandmother couldn't take care of her. And so she was raised by her own grandmother. And it was a time when women didn't have to go to school. It wasn't considered important for society. And so when they broke up, as my father was rising and being elevated, she said she didn't want a penny from him. She didn't want him to support her at all. This is the African pride, the female pride. And she said that all she wanted was for him to pay for my education, my sister's education. And that was a deal that they made. And so when I was growing up, every Friday afternoon, I would be driven in a Mercedes-Benz to my mom's house. My sister and I, we would get there was no electricity. And we, on Saturday morning, had to go to the well to fetch enough water for the weekend. And that same driver in the Mercedes would come and pick us up on a Sunday evening, take us back to our dad's place. And so growing up in that kind of environment and having to navigate the worlds of poverty and privilege on a weekly basis ended up shaping my entire experience, my entire perspective on life, and some of the choices that I made growing up. And so went to primary school in Togo, but then because my family on both sides is very, very deeply religious, very, very devout Catholic, as soon as I became a teenager, I was sent to boarding school in France, outside Paris. And I was raised by Oratorians. And so I can very much relate to a lot of the rigor intellectual rigor that comes with the kind of sacrifice that Oratorians preach. And so to accelerate that, I ended up doing very well in school, going to some of the most prestigious schools and universities around the world. And because my father had a swift rise and a swift fall in politics, and he was fired by the president, and he became a pariah and couldn't get a job as a civil servant at the age of 50, he ended up not in poverty, but he ended up destitute himself at the age of 50, and he died very young of a heart attack, and I was still in my 20s. And what was interesting about that is, all of a sudden, as the eldest, I was the one in charge, and I had to take care of many people in my family. So thank God, I became quite successful as an entrepreneur in the media business. I started a media company which became very, very popular in Europe and America. It was funded by Goldman Sachs. And I was able to sell my company before I turned 40. And so I was a young millionaire, but instead of starting another company, which was a lot of my New York friends were encouraging, I decided to go back to Togo and work with the people around my mom and my family to try to understand what some of the challenges were. So I just chose youth entrepreneurship as my battle. And I created a program and an organization in Togo, which became the #1 youth organization with respect to entrepreneurship. And what was interesting about the way that we helped to train those young entrepreneurs in Togo, and I mean micro entrepreneurs, these are people who are trying to raise the equivalent of maybe $1,000 to start a business, and that's a lot of money in Togo, was that we try to push for traditional kind of business education. It didn't work. And what I found, and what my team found, was that real success could be traced to personal initiative. And what I mean by personal initiative is young people in mostly Francophone countries in Africa have been brainwashed that they're often, despite themselves, in this constant inferiority complex mode, where as soon as they see white people showing up, they think that white people are gonna come and save them. And so it was really interesting to me going there with my wife, who's white and French, and showing up at these local community centers to identify young entrepreneurs for their training program. So I was traveling across the country to identify the most promising entrepreneurs, and 90% of the young people thought she was in charge because she was white. And meanwhile, I'm the kid from Lomé who went to New York and started working with Google and Goldman Sachs and all these big companies. And so I figured that the mindsets, the mentalities were the first things we needed to change. And so building on that, the World Bank took my program and created a major study throughout the country that they published in 2018, which I'd love to share with you. And they felt that the focus on personal initiative was a bit of a silver bullet, specifically as related to young women. And if you focus even more specifically on women, you tend to see a lot more results, a lot more quickly. And the kind of traction that you can see by empowering women is something that's very, very real. So I did that, and the program is ongoing, but I started thinking about how we could do this on a Pan-African level. And about 2 years ago, I thought that what Africa really needed and what young Africans really needed was education. And so I decided to create an online platform called True Africa University, which has this mission of accelerating higher learning in Africa by empowering young Africans, brilliant young Africans, ambitious young Africans, initiative-taking young Africans. And I'm really happy to report that Jeff and I have partnered on this, and we've been working on this, and MIT has been supporting this venture, and we started the very first course in July. And this is how I feel we could create lasting change across the continent, because if we start with 1,000 students, then go to 10,000 students and 100,000 students, 1 million students, then those million students, once they graduate from these programs, they could become the new leaders of Africa so that they can help to change these mindsets that are always about expecting solutions to come from the outside world, come from white people, come from governments. And that's why I wanted to really push this kind of youth empowerment focus and just kind of share my story, because I felt it was important to talk about poverty from a lived experience perspective and not necessarily from a theoretical perspective.